Good day, everyone. Welcome to our press conference. We have admitted everyone who was in the waiting room, so we are ready to start. My name is Solima Latsi. I'll be chairing the presser today. I am joined by my colleague, Refilu Nzege, who's also our national spokesperson. We'll be joined by our head of policy, Ms. Gwen Ngwenya, and the party's federal chairperson, Dr. Ivan Meyer. So how we will run this press conference is that Dr. Ivan Meyer will take us through the outline of the process that was initiated in the lead up to the policy conference. Then Gwen will take us through the program for the policy conference that will be taking place on Saturday and Sunday, and also some of the key policy proposals that will be on the table for the next 2 days. When that is done, we will be taking questions from the media. So you can indicate by pressing the raise hand button. We will be able to track who are the individuals that have raised their hands for the questions. I will take per round 3 questions so that we give each other sufficient time and for the visual operation to work smoothly. Then we'll have responses and take another round. So without wasting any more of your time, I'd like to welcome Dr. Ivan Meyer to take us through the process.
Sally, I'm sorry, it seems as if Dr. Meyer is struggling. Oh, I see.
No, he's there.
Dr. Meyer. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Cool.
Good afternoon, colleagues, and thank you for this opportunity. As part of the Democratic Alliance, there was a specific progress and report in terms of how we want to proceed with the policy conference. We have constituted a policy steering committee around the end of January. That's now pre-COVID. We then have also had an online portal, policy portal, open for comments, because we believe it is very important to regularly engage with the structures of the party. So we have created the online policy portal for people to comment on the various documents. The documents that we've released, for example, was on the 7th of February. This was a document dealing with the principles and the values framework of the Democratic Alliance. On the 28th of February, we also released an economic justice policy framework. Was well discussed within the structures of the party, particularly here in February and in March. The Democratic Alliance, through the Federal Policy Unit, had provincial policy consultation. We had extensive provincial council meetings where these draft policies were discussed and the various inputs that we have received during the portal. The online portal also closed for policy comments because we were in difficult times during COVID-19. So most of those issues were also then captured on the portal. We then had the remaining, this was about 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, had some final policy consultations with the Free State DA as well as with the Northwest DA, because those were the 2 outstanding policy consultations we needed to do. And between the 24th of July till the 14th of August, we had the policy conference amendment window. We have subsequently extended that window opportunity to allow for people to submit additional amendments to the policy draft document. Well, tomorrow, the Democratic Alliance will again make history by conducting its first virtual policy conference. And the policy conference is a very important phase as we prepare also for 2 elections, one for the local government election, but also more appropriately as we embark on the election for 2024. But nothing precludes us to have some further subsequent policy discussions, because that is the mandate of the Federal Council. And so we are looking forward to these processes that will unfold tomorrow. This is one of the widest consultative processes the Democratic Alliance ever had in the party to discuss the economic justice, the values and the principles, and also to give people an opportunity. In addition, we not only gave people an opportunity that are members of the party, we also gave people general, the media, the public, academics at universities, researchers, all of them were given an opportunity to comment, because we don't believe that the policy domain is only the domain of people inside the party. We wanted to make it inclusive as possible, also listen to other advice, particularly researchers in the various substantive policy fields. All of these have shaped and influenced the policy architecture of these draft policy positions, which will be discussed tomorrow and Sunday at the DA's policy conference. And I'm looking forward to engage with all the colleagues, and I want to thank many of the South Africans outside the DA, those inside the DA, for assisting and helping us to create a policy platform and a policy architecture to navigate us out of the current situation, gridlock in South Africa, because the Democratic Alliance is the biggest single party outside the governing party, the official opposition. And so this will be the policy platform of the official opposition, a government in waiting, to shape the future based on an alternative policy framework in South Africa. Thank you, Solly.
Thanks very much, Ivan. And now we can move to Gwen's section on the program for the next 2 days, key policy draft documents that are on the table. Gwen, you can go.
Thank you, Solly. I think everyone will recognize that already, pre even the COVID pandemic, South Africa was already in a pretty dire economic situation. Our fundamentals were not looking good. So I think even then it was quite clear that we needed to prioritize and focus on a policy platform to deal with economic exclusion, to deal with the fact that over 2 decades after apartheid, the majority of South Africans find themselves locked out of the economy. But obviously that need has only become more urgent now in the situation that we found ourselves in. And so I think it's still really opportune for the kind of conversations that we hope to have this weekend. On the first day, we will look at our values and principles that will inform policy making. This is very important because sometimes policy disagreements or as a result of not being on the same page or having fully discussed the core values and principles that inform that policy approach. And obviously, whilst from a policymaker perspective, one might want policy to be informed almost entirely by an evidence-based approach, evidence-based policy making also has to take into consideration the context, the values and beliefs of where you're starting from, and the kinds of, or that context that informs the policies that you are designing. So the first day is a very important opportunity for us to make sure that we're on the same page about what we value and what we want to see and how our policies are expressed. And as a result, you will see that reflected in various articulations of our values and principles and items such as separation of party and state, of federalism, of a social market economy. So really getting to grips with what we envision the role of government to be in a society like ours, where so many are in need, but at the same time to balance that with the needs of a growing economy. And so that first day is really to set the appropriate foundation. On the second day, we will then primarily look at the draft economic justice policy, which has been available since March for everyone to engage with. And essentially this really then on a policy level starts to get to grips with how we address economic exclusion. And just as a summary, I suppose, because we do want to open it up to questions and for an engagement this morning, is that just as a summary, the approach that it takes is to say that really economic exclusion is driven by a number of factors. So there are a number of drivers of inequality that actually work together to create a cycle of deprivation and poverty that people become trapped in. And it's so very important that any economic empowerment policy or economic inclusion policy worth its salt actually pays attention to the key drivers of economic inequality and attempts to address those, because that's really what we need to do. And so it summarizes those key drivers of inequality based on research. It's not what we think drives inequality. It's what, for example, the latest Stats SA report into inequality in South Africa expresses as key drivers of inequality. It's also looking at, for example, the latest World Bank report on the drivers of inequality in South Africa, of poverty and inequality. So it's informed by a number of studies that look at really what drives poverty and inequality in our country. And it lands with, for example, unemployment, poor educational outcomes, the state of malnutrition and high mobility costs that South Africans face. We look at the breakdown of South African family, the fact that the kind of migratory system of labor in South Africa still persists, which means that most children grow up with both their parents, and the socioeconomic consequences of that particular phenomenon. And it also looks at wealth inequality, which is so important, because sometimes when we talk about inequality, most people focus on income inequality, but it also looks at the low savings culture in South Africa, and where savings are happening, that they're in fact happening in low return vehicles. So people are saving in low return vehicles. And so it's so important to address those factors that work together to in fact create an obstacle for economic mobility in the country. So our proposals are so wide-ranging in this document precisely because the causes, the drivers of inequality are not narrow. It's not one thing. It's not white monopoly capital. It's not some silver bullet reason that people have. People live in a context in which their daily existence is weighed upon by a multitude of factors which together work to keep people trapped in poverty and to keep them excluded from the economy. So any approach has to really be holistic. So then the next question this document asks is obviously, okay, fine, those are the drivers of economic inequality. And we lay out some of the steps and policies that in government we would take in order to address these various drivers. But obviously in South Africa, an important question is, well, what is the role of the private sector? Is the private sector going to play any role in addressing these drivers of inequality? And the answer is that yes, we do see a role for the private sector in addressing these drivers of inequality for two reasons, really. The first is that the enormity of the task is such that no single stakeholder in society can actually achieve this on their own. And certainly the state that the government fiscus in, that's the state of our public service, the state of government at the moment especially indicates that on its own, it cannot rise up to the challenge that all of these issues present. But secondly, besides needing a partner in defeating economic injustice, it's also important for the private sector itself to, as commonly is called, to be able to gain that social license to operate. There can sometimes in South Africa be a great deal of resentment against capital, against white monopoly capital in particular, as we've seen that campaign gain hold. And so it's important that they do play a part in what's seen as being part of addressing these historical inequalities. And so how they will play that part, and what actually overlaps very nicely as a model with this particular approach, are the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, they commit themselves and set targets precisely on the kind of issues that we are trying to address. So if you're talking about addressing unemployment, poverty, malnutrition, etc., all of these goals can be found, their expression can be found in the SDGs. And what's very useful is that globally, companies around the world have already started committing themselves to contributing to achieving the SDGs. And there are many listed companies already reporting on their SDG commitments and contributions. The advantage of that is that you are not introducing a parochial, localized system that potential investors and businesses are not going to understand. You're introducing something that is part of already an international language around how we balance financial return and socioeconomic impact. So it's going to be immediately recognizable to the business and investor community, which makes its adaptability from our current approach to this approach that we are suggesting pretty much a seamless one. And because it focuses on the SDGs, we think it will target the kind of beneficiaries in society who find themselves vulnerable to disease, vulnerable to high mobility costs, vulnerable to spatial inequalities. The people who suffer from each of these inequalities we've been talking about will be the direct beneficiaries of any targeting of SDGs. And it eliminates the potential for patronage and corruption and for further empowerment to go to those who have repeatedly been empowered and now continue to be empowered at the expense of those who are still without. So, I mean, essentially, that's the summary of that particular approach. And then also what we will consider on the day. There's only so much one can get through in 2 days, but we thought it very important to also have a space for policy resolutions, which come from our various spokespersons to really say, to set the agenda, I suppose, for the policy unit going forward, because the policy conference is not the be all and end all of policy. Policy development is not going to stop this weekend. We're going to continue doing so. So it's important for us to be on the same page about what are the future policy development priorities that we need to focus on. And so there will be a process after that economic justice policy to take stock of the key policy areas that we need to focus on. As a party, and particularly for the policy unit to assist the party in developing a stronger position on those areas. So in its entirety, if you look at the 2 days, we've discussed the values and principles that form the foundation of policy making. We get into an economic exclusion policy, so an economic justice policy, how to address economic exclusion, which really takes up our focus for most of that second day, because we think that issue is so particularly important, that as we grow in the context of all our other growth proposals, because we do have economic growth proposals, and I think we've always been really strong there, is to say, but as we are creating a growing economy, how do we also make sure that that growing economy is inclusive? And so that takes up the bulk of that second day. And then to look at the kinds of policies that must inform future policy development. I think I'll leave it there, Solly. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks very much, Gwen and Dr. Ivan Meyer. So as I outlined earlier on, to my colleagues from the media who have questions, use the raise button icon so that you can raise your hand in there. I'll recognize 3 hands per round. We will take those questions and then get back. And in between speakers, let's have some patience to allow for the end of the question and for the person who will be speaking to be connected so that they can speak without any interruption. So I'll be going through the chat button to just check the hands that are there for questions. Govan, Lucy.
Sorry, it's Yan. Where is the raise hand function?
Okay, if you go to participants, Yan, you will then see 4 different options. You can press the raise hand button. If you are struggling, you can text me and then I can then allow you to ask your questions. But from my initial checking of the list, I see 2 hands. So we will start with Govan, then go to Busi, and then the third one will be Yan. So if you can start by indicating the media house you are representing and then go straight into your question. We will take all the questions at once so that we don't have individual responses to questions. So to kick off, we'll start with Govan.
Hi, thank you. It's Govan Whittles here from ENCA. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, proceed. We can hear you.
Thanks so much. Gwen, what were the proposals on dealing with economic justice and the policy? And you mentioned the research from Stats SA and the World Bank on the drivers of inequality. Could you mention any other research that you've relied on to determine what the drivers are of inequality? And you haven't said what proposals you have that were submitted regarding how to deal with economic inequality. To put it more directly, Are there any proposals on incorporating race-based redress and developing a policy which gives access to economic opportunity based on race? That's one. My second question is, will the policy conference consider any submissions that were made by people on the online portal who have since left the party? And then finally, you're developing policy here. You're saying that you also want to deal with spatial inequality, and I wanted to get more clarity on the policy after it's developed. Will this policy be the foundation of the Democratic Alliance's campaign for the local government election, or will you also be directing the Democratic Alliance's deployees in government, particularly in the Western Cape, to change how they govern the province based on the resolutions of the policy conference, specifically dealing with spatial inequality, as we saw this week that the High Court set aside the Western Cape government sale of the Tafelberg School, saying that it had to use the land to develop social housing and give access to land to the working class, and arguing that it does fall within a reconstruction zone. I think you know what I'm talking about there, Glenn. Thank you. That's it.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Govan. Can we move to Busi, who's the second journalist to ask questions?
I hope you can hear me. It's Busi from the SABC. My first question is, how many delegates are going to be attending your policy conference? The second thing is, you talk about this is the widest possible consultation that you've ever had. Can you just tell us a little bit more about that? And I'm asking this against the backdrop of the fact that from an access point of view, you know, not everybody has access to online facilities, online platform. So how do you think that's also going to work? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Busi. The third one and the final questions for this round will be Yan Yan.
Thanks, Solly. Here comes the original 8-part question. Firstly, Dr. Meyer, whom I always call Dr. Layer, said in the beginning that policy in the DA is not just a matter for the DA and DA members. That is why you took input from so many places and so many experts and non-experts. My question then is, how is it well considered to close this Congress for media reporting? Firstly, because it isn't only DA people who have to, in the end, decide whether they like this or not, and they would like to be well informed. But secondly, in your own interest, it is absolutely true that your party has very specific divisions, and there has been in the past cases of misinformation. Now, when you close a discussion, the media has no choice but to get it secondhand and to get it from sources who may not always speak the truth. So how was that a good decision? Secondly, as I understand it, the policy paper is the basis of the discussion to such an extent, and I might be misunderstanding this, that all proposals and amendments, which all had to be forwarded even before this conference, if I understand it correctly, can only be done from the basis of the policy discussion document. Does this not mean that some opinions and some policy proposals would be sort of almost nullified or muted by the fact that that there is such a set way of doing this? If I were to be a DA member, which I am not, and I wanted to participate, and I wanted to make a completely different proposal, how do I do this in this conference or congress, if that is the case, that it is so very strict. Then arising from that, these principles of the DA are sometimes very difficult to pin down. Any principle is, because language is in the eye of the, or in the mouth of the user, and every word means exactly what you choose it to mean. So when you have this discussion on the first day about what principles and the basis of the DA is, that could of course become a bit of a way to limit discussion. Once it is decided, a principle can never be set in stone in a political party. Political parties change with the times, and sometimes people didn't quite say what they wanted to say, maybe misstated. So my question there would be, was anything that was proposed left out of this policy document? And could you give us some of the examples of DA members making proposals that do not fit with the principles? Then on the issue of race, which Govan also raised, the chair of the Federal Executive of the Democratic Alliance is on record that she no longer believes that race is a proxy for poverty. This issue is multifaceted and nuanced. What is the proposal in that regard? And then my next question is on spatial inequality, and I want to join with Govan in that this school that he refers to, this is not a small matter. Tafelberg School in Sea Point, which was sold by the Western Cape government to a Jewish private school for a very low amount, and which is 50 meters from my house. I can see it from my house, almost like that woman saw Alaska. And the point here is that the DA has a bad reputation for not always looking after the poor, especially if it would place the poor but in the middle of the wealthy, which this area is. To what extent will the DA be able to tell its middle and upper class supporters that it is necessary, it is absolutely necessary for the poor to live between and among them? That is the end of my 8-part question.
Thanks very much, Jan. It is for this purpose of this press conference that we initiated with you guys so that you can ask the questions. So Gwen and Dr. Ivan Meyer, it's your turn to deal with those questions.
Sorry, I'll go first. Thank you very much, colleagues, and thank you for these particular matters that you've raised. Gwen will deal with some of those issues relating to the economic justice framework and spatial inequality issues. But the questions about will this form the basis for our strategy going forward in terms of the local government election? Well, I think this will be part of it, because we had earlier this year also a virtual local government manifesto workshop specifically looking at local government issues. We had an extensive discussion with councillors around the country, and in that local government manifesto workshop, we unpacked many of the critical issues that will form the basis of the manifesto as we go forward in terms of the local government election. But clearly, there are critical issues relating to local government issues that are also will be discussed as part of our conversation here over this weekend. So yes, together with the local government manifesto workshop, as well as the policy conversation, that will be, and the Federal Congress that will take place later the year, will become the basis of our election manifesto. This is also the first time that we had in the Democratic Alliance an extensive consultative process to develop a local government manifesto. So all of this will feed into the local government manifesto so that it is two things, evidence-based and pragmatic. Evidence so that we can test these things and not make up policies as we wish, but also that it is researchable, that there's evidence, and also very important in terms of the Democratic Alliance, that we can prove these policies has been implemented or can be implemented successfully in practice. So pragmatism, evidence-based practice for us is very critical. Busi, yes, I think more than 200 people will attend the Congress as delegates over the weekend. This is a special federal policy conference. We had extensive and wide consultation. One of the things that we often do in government and in politics is that we think that we are the only people with wisdom about how to solve societal and political problems. We've overcome that by giving people a platform to influence. There are many people that do research on health and housing and other related matters. So we also gave them an opportunity to influence our policy thinking, because one of the things that we must not become is to become arrogant to think that we have the sole wisdom in terms of policy. We obviously have a federal constitution. We have principles and values that navigate how we see the political philosophical framework that underpins these various political and public policy choices. Well, I think we have also given people access to these online facilities to influence this, because many times you cannot write a policy in a conference. A conference consider policy proposals, so we have created ample time. We went around the country through extensive provincial consultative councils. We've tabled these drafts. People have made inputs, and Gwen and the policy team has subsequently produced a report based on all the consultative work that we have done. So I think we have been able to successfully give everybody an ample opportunity. And for those, and we must understand that not everybody likes to write critical policy documents, and some like to discuss it. So we have given them both those particular options. Jan, I think very importantly, you refer to the divisions of the past. I think many of these divisions, if one does a clinical analysis of what these divisions were about, it was about policy choices, policy positions, and political philosophies. And so what we have tried to do here is to get policy clarity. During the review process that we have done in the Democratic Alliance last year, it was clear that we must have a policy conference to give absolute policy clarity, to avoid double speak in this particular situation. And this is what this policy conference is absolutely aimed at. In our constitution as a Democratic Alliance, we have founding provisions, we have principles and values. But those things are written in a legalistic and constitutional language. And many of our colleagues, unfortunately, have also misinterpreted, misunderstood what is in the language of the values and principles as is in the Constitution. So we're not changing the values and the principles, because those are foundational things in the Constitution of the Democratic Alliance. What this conference does, it does flesh out in practical terms, what does this mean on the ground for our members, for South Africa, for the future of South Africa, so that there's not any more ambiguity about what these principles are. So that's the purpose of this. I think the Western Cape is very much committed also to mixed-use development in terms of the housing development. Gwen can maybe speak more detail about those particular issues, but we are here to present not the final plans, but the process, the broader policy architecture. But the policy conference this weekend, they will express their views. Once they've expressed their views, we will certainly have another process which the colleagues can explain afterwards, and Solly, to bring the media on board in terms of many of these issues. Thank you, Solly, back to you.
Thanks, Dr. Meyer. Gwen, you can deal with the outstanding questions.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, there are quite a few. I'll try to be as thorough but also brief as possible. There was a question early on in terms of what are the actual proposals. I mean, I think for the purpose of brevity, I can say that I think for this briefing, what we wanted to do was present the framework and the approach so that it's easier to then understand where we're coming from. But for detail, I must please refer everyone to the broader policy document. If hopefully our media department has made that available to you all, because I mean, it's about a 50 or so page long document. So there are a number of proposals, but the important thing is that they are related to a variety or a list of drivers of inequality, which is so important that we take that holistic approach and that we aren't just talking about addressing economic empowerment as about addressing one thing, because there is a temptation sometimes in our political discourse to reduce economic empowerment to just addressing one factor. So I think in terms of differences in approach, that's a very important thing to bear in mind. And then to see the detailed proposals under each section, please do give reference to that draft document. Obviously bearing in mind that a final then document will be available hopefully in the course of the next week after the conference. Will contributions by those who have left be taken into account? I must say, actually, when we were taking comments from the portal, we didn't, we got so many comments that we weren't even looking at necessarily the name of who was, putting the comment in. And I think that also just allows us to be fairly agnostic about how we aggregate and look at the comments. So comments by people who have left may very well have now found their way into the feedback report and our analysis, or they may have not. I mean, it's hard to say because we didn't itemize each comment per, we didn't rank it by who was submitting that comment. So if they gave comments during the window, that was really the important thing to have done, is to have given comments within the window of time given. And if somebody did that, then there's a very high likelihood that their comments will make their way into being considered. Will it direct government action? Well, I suppose the DA's policies are always to inform our program of action, and maybe just a little bit in terms of, because the focus now is obviously on the policy conference, but in general, there are a number of policy working groups or policy commissions through which we have regular policy discussions when we invite external policy experts and academics to help us think around and to talk on different subjects. And on those commissions from the party side, so aside from the external guests we may invite to present and to participate, from the party side, those policy commissions will include all our spokespersons in that relevant area. So when we have, for example, a housing policy workshop, or if we have an economic policy workshop, it will include our spokespersons on that particular portfolio from the national legislature, from all our provincial legislatures, and then with representatives from local government. And that's kind of the core list we work with. But again, these are actually open policy workshops that anyone can attend. But we work with those group of people as the core to make sure that any policy, when it's being thought about and considered, includes at least those group of people initially. Okay, I think Ivan, if I can remember quickly, has dealt with a lot of the process and conference questions, so around how many delegates will be at the conference, from an access point of view, etc. Okay, party, in terms of some of Yanyan's questions, I think, and I say this, hopefully as fairly as possible, and I take your comments into regard, where you say, you can only write on what you receive or based on what people tell you. So that's sometimes the disadvantage of secondhand information. So I take that completely. And maybe what I would add to that is that, this perception of strong divisions on the policy front are not supported, I suppose, by the consultations and the amendments received. So I think, again, I won't go into the whole process. Ivan's done that. But many of the amendments and contributions received are very constructive. I look forward to including them in the documents. There's nothing that is, that sets us apart. There's no amendment received where I could say, well, I can't be in the same party as somebody who would make this kind of proposal. No, it's just, people discussing and putting in contributions. And as Ivan said, one can't know everything. So in fact, one looks forward to comment. You know, you don't put together a policy document hoping that nobody will have any additions or nobody will have anything to say on it. You hope to receive ways in which you can improve it and make it better. And I think to the extent that that has happened for the documents this weekend, they will be part of a healthy discussion to strengthen the documents. I don't think there's anything received that would weaken the document should it find its way in. But obviously what finds its way in the ultimate documents will depend on the delegates this weekend. And the process is not strict at all. So contributions could have been received on any area. So the policy unit or myself didn't decide on the content for this weekend. FedEx early on before the what is it called? Sorry, the steering committee. There was a policy steering committee that was put together to make sure that the policy conference preparations included as many people as possible. And obviously a weekend is finite, you know, there is only anyway so much you can decide. So a decision was made that, look, the economy is important, we must include that. There was a decision that, look, we have to look at values and principles, but so much, the economy covers a lot of ground. So within the broad framework of, okay, we have to discuss economic exclusion, any contributions that people felt would contribute to a solution on dealing with economic exclusion could have been submitted. And anyone thought should inform our values and principles for policymaking could also have been included. So on the portal, for example, you had an opportunity to comment on the documents, but then at the end of all the portal documents, it said, is there any other comments? So you could then, and there wasn't kind of limit to that. So then you can then put in anything else. So that's where you can then put in something that is not a direct comment to the document, but just your own kind of blue sky thinking on that particular, you know, on values and principles or on economic exclusion. So I think it was fairly open in that sense. And then also it was open in the sense that, well, there were all of these physical, when we could still have them, policy consultations. And again, they were wide ranging in what, you know, anyone could bring forward. And maybe just to close off then on that point is just to say that in general, you know, anyone can come forward with the policy document. It's not like the policy unit or any structure of the party will only consider policy that comes from the policy unit. No, that's not the case. In fact, policies or positions get developed all the time that are not necessarily from the policy unit. So indeed, that would just be a message that I always try and say with anyone I engage with. If there's a policy area that you are passionate about, that you have an interest in, please do write up something, do present it to the party, let's talk about it. So anyone can come forward with a policy document or a policy proposal that they would like discussed. And then, sorry, there were just quite a lot of questions. So I just want to make sure that I get to them, is that, you know, principles, as you quite rightly say, aren't set in stone. And, you know, policies must be, sometimes people say, living documents. So this is just one opportunity. I think I said that also in the beginning, to discuss and come together to talk about policy. But just because policy is fluid doesn't mean you must then never arrive at a decision. So you periodically, you come up with a decision, and then you must obviously periodically review it to ensure that it's not stuck. What we're doing now, it will be, these documents will be our position as of, you know, this date. But yes, in 6 months' time, in a year, weekly, if you refer to the policy workshops, we have policy workshops weekly, but constantly you must be talking about policy and seeing whether our policies are still relevant. So that's definitely true. We have to come to a decision, but it must always be a live issue in a sense, as you say. Race as proxy, gosh, I know everyone, you know, this can become a sticking point for those who, I'd say, maybe don't engage with kind of inequality or economic studies that much, because I don't know who actually put this like phrase in the domain, but it can become a bit of a distraction because in my view, of course, race is a proxy, but it depends on if we're talking about the same thing. So I've often approached it from a kind of research or statistical point of view when we say that sometimes there are things that are very difficult to measure. A good example is maybe, let's say, happiness, where let's say you wanted to make sure that you create a society in which people feel happy, okay? but it's very difficult to bring down to a measure what happiness is. So you might then start having a conversation around, okay, so what can we use as a proxy for happiness? Because we care about people being happy, and we want to make sure that we increase happiness, but happiness isn't a thing that can easily be measured. So are there any useful proxies for happiness? And that for me is the context in which really a discussion around proxies becomes really important, when the thing you are trying to address is very difficult to measure and to pin down. But in the case of inequality and we can pin it down. So for me, it's not so much whether race is or isn't a proxy. I think it can be used as a proxy. The question is rather, do you need proxies for disadvantage when there are so many excellent studies that can tell you in less murky terms that can really explain in detail what disadvantage looks like. So it's not enough to just say, okay, the majority of the disadvantaged are Black. That's a very useful thing to know and to note. And we say that in our policy documents that the majority of disadvantaged South Africans are Black in this country, but we also want to know more about those people. I don't want to just leave it at saying, okay, you're Black. I need to know more about your situation. And that's where those other indicators of disadvantage are so important, because it can tell us, okay, many people suffer from malnutrition. So many children end up being stunted even before the age of 5. Oh, okay, so we need to address stunting in particular. We know that, okay, the disadvantage takes the shape. It's about, high mobility costs. So sometimes people have to spend a great deal of money just going to and from work. So we must actually lower reservation wages. If it costs you, if you spend 500 Rand paying for public transport or basically paying for transport to go to and from work each day, it means that any job you get must at least pay you 500 Rand or more, because why would you accept a job in that area that pays you less than 500 Rand when your transport is when your transport is 500 Rand? So you have to bear in mind mobility costs and how those push up reservation wages for people. So these kind of indicators of inequality start to give you, like, basically if race is the outline of like a picture, saying that the majority in South Africa who are disadvantaged are Black, these indicators start to color that picture in and say, okay, but what is the specific challenges they are grappling with on a daily basis? What does access to healthcare look like? What do their mobility costs or challenges look like? What does, et cetera, all of these areas we're talking about. So I'm not the person who introduced this debate between whether race is a proxy or race isn't a proxy. And I know many people end up becoming kind of entangled in this web of that discussion. But I think it moves us away from dealing with the challenges that people face, because we end up in a very abstract and intellectualized conversation that actually isn't rooted in the problems that people are facing. So if you want to engage in that discussion about whether race is a proxy or not, I think it's a distracting discussion. But if you wanted to engage in it, I would say, yes, of course, it can be a proxy. But why are you using a proxy when you can actually get even more detailed about this thing? It's useful to use proxies when the thing you are talking about, like happiness, isn't well defined. But when we can get more well defined, let's do so that we can actually have more targeted and more specific policies. Sorry, that was a long discussion, but I think a lot of people do get trapped in this kind of murky web of this debate. And I think it's not really the debate we should be having. It doesn't really get down to the nub of what we are trying to address. And I hope then, just lastly, you said the DA can have this reputation, and I think that if we succeed in continuing to build our track record, which definitely says the contrary, our track record of creating jobs, of governing in a clean way, of delivering services, of sticking true to the kind of, the COVID pandemic was a good example where we really made sure that we used that period, which was so difficult for many South Africans to be in lockdown, to really ramp up healthcare capacity in the Western Cape. And I think in some ways, when you're talking about whether a government is pro-poor or not, you actually have to sometimes stop talking and just focus on doing. So I think where we slip up, we must address that, but we must continue being focused and showing people that we are pro-poor instead of talking about being pro-poor. There's a place for discussion, and policy is that, but at the end of the day, people also have to feel it. And I hope that you know, these policies this weekend at least support what we are doing.
Cool. Thanks very much to both Gwen and Ivan. Colleagues, we've got a logistical limitation here because we had booked the Zoom facility for until 1, but you'll understand that the length of the previous questions solicited the length of the responses. So I'll quickly go on to the next round. Can you at least be quick enough so that we don't get cut off on Zoom? And in the event that we are unable to do so, I mean, there'll still be opportunities throughout the weekend to engage with us and the policy unit on the questions that you may have. And you will see that the media alert has gone out with the contact details of the communications team that you can get in touch with. So for this round, I'll recognize Greg. I'll also recognize Zianda. And there was a question from the SABC that came through WhatsApp that was raising the question about whether the party is anticipating any logistical challenges for this weekend and if we are better prepared to do so. So for now, I'll ask Greg to shoot.
Hi, yep, I hope you can hear me. I've got a bit of a bad connection. Hello? Let me just go for it. Oh. Hello, Solly.
Great. I think you can go for it.
Thank you. So my question is just on the using the Sustainable Development Goal system to address economic exclusion. So I just want to be clear that one of the ideas around that is prioritizing government procurement to companies who meet these SDG metrics. And if so, how does this make sure that we continue to develop and help Black-owned businesses or new entrants to markets rather than just prioritizing and paying, enriching sort of the same large existing corporations, some of whom had sort of benefited from the apartheid system? Thank you.
Thanks, Greg. Can we go to Zianda?
All right, it's Zianda from Newsroom Africa. Just a clarity-seeking question. Will delegates be allowed to raise new proposals during the conference as opposed to discussing what's presented during the two-day gathering? I'm asking because there's already a sense from some of those who will be attending that there might be some sort of muzzling, for lack of a better word, of those wanting to raise issues, particularly when it comes to race, the economy, and land.
Okay, cool. Thanks for those questions. Can we deal with these as quickly as we can?
Sorry to interrupt you, man. I do have more
Sure.
questions. I didn't realize we'd only get one opportunity.
Sure.
Will you take my questions?
Let's finish with this round and then we'll make time for your follow-up.
Thank you so much.
Cheers.
Solly, thank you very much. I'll be very brief this time. The question was about do we expect any technical or logistical hiccups? Well, what we've done, we've tested the virtual platform.
Colleagues, we seem to be struggling with sound from Dr. Meyer.
No, we're not. He's just on mute.
Oh.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now. You are going to have to start from the beginning.
Okay. Very briefly, in terms of the technical and logistical challenges that we might experience, what we have done as the party, we have done an extensive audit of the technical platform capability as well as venues and data connectivity. We also gave some Zoom training, and we also did a test on the virtual platform for this policy conference. In addition, for those venues that there might be some having technical problems, we have some generators on standby to assist those particular people. But we have done an extensive audit about all those challenges so that we can have mitigation strategies in that particular regard. To Sayanda, Well, we have decided, we have given people different platforms to make policy inputs. We have also decided that we will not take at the policy conference any new inputs because we want to discuss the policy documents as well as the amendments. So people were given an opportunity to submit amendments, and there are amendments that people have submitted to the policy unit, and those amendments we will put before the policy conference. So yes, those issues will be discussed. But if there are any other matters that people want to discuss, we can arrange at any time a future Federal Council meeting to discuss those particular issues. But for this one, we are asking people to submit policy proposals to be discussed and through the normal processes of amendments to draft policy documents. Solly, I'm given the time frame, now hand over to you.
Okay, cool. Gwen, do you have anything to add?
Yes, please. Just to that question about small businesses and how we bring them in this kind of SDG approach. I mean, one of the points that is really made in this document is that in addition to addressing kind of these socioeconomic drivers of inequality, we actually have to really focus first on growing the economy. So you have to have a growing economy, and then to really be worried about, well, how do you share the benefits of that growing economy? And one of the ways obviously is to encourage small business. And we take the same approach as we did to this one. You have to really understand what is the problem first before you then propose a solution. So what are some of the key challenges that small businesses face in trying to, why do so many small businesses fail? Well, a lot of these reasons find themselves in high barriers to entry, which is why we think it's so important to reduce red tape for businesses, and also to kind of stop this kind of Faustian pact that I often call that exists in South Africa between sometimes big business and government and unions, where they agree to legislative or frameworks within which small and medium-sized businesses cannot in fact operate. So we have to make sure that our regulatory environment is conducive for small businesses to also participate. And another big issue is that many small businesses start, but their success is fundamentally tied to being able to obviously be sustainable and carry capital over. And many small businesses run out of working capital for an easily fixed, but problematic and systemic reason that both government departments and in fact larger companies who are part of their, for which they serve as, within their supply chain, don't pay small businesses on time. I mean, it's kind of been a long-standing thing in South Africa where we talk about payments within 30 days, but that often doesn't happen. And at any one point, the amount of money that is outstanding, owed to small businesses, either from the private sector or from government departments that is owed to smaller companies, is astronomical. So you have smaller businesses waiting 3 months or more to get paid, and that absolutely kills a small business. They're literally running hand to mouth, day to day, and when they don't get paid, it wipes them out. So those kind of challenges are really the kind of barriers that small businesses face, and which, if they can be addressed, will obviously help to ensure that more small businesses in fact do survive. And we have policies in that regard, proposals that mention that in this document in this regard. And I think it's an important place also to very quickly then add and say, look, at the end of the day, this is an economic empowerment policy. So it's setting the framework so that people understand what exactly do we value, or what is our approach in addressing economic empowerment. But it's not going to be our only policy. So it's not as though the economic empowerment policy is the only policy that we have and the others don't exist. So in a lot of these areas, whilst we may touch on health, whilst we may touch on mobility, whilst we may touch on economic growth in this document, these will also have to have standalone policies that speak to these areas, and many of them do exist if you look at our website. So similarly, we wouldn't look at a small business policy necessarily and say, but you don't say enough about trade or exports. It's like, well, we do say a little bit to the extent that it's relevant to small business, but we probably would say more in a fuller standalone policy in that area. So please also do look at our policy proposals in total, like including the ones that currently exist to be read in with this one. Because obviously an economic empowerment document cannot cover every single policy area in detail. So it also mentions education, but we still have an education policy. This doesn't replace our education policy. It just mentions the role of education within addressing economic exclusion. And any new proposals? Yes, I mean, this conference this weekend is about discussing, but obviously you have to have an agenda. I don't think the lack of being able to go outside an agenda means that something is punitive. You know, you have to have an agenda for the day. You know, we can't 1 minute be talking about health and then, you know, 5 minutes we want to talk about something completely different. So there is an agenda set, which is discussing values and principles on the first day. Although, I mean, that's a very broad umbrella, right? A lot can be said under what are your values and principles. It allows people to raise a variety of issues. Similarly, on the second day, the theme is economic exclusion and economic justice. Again, such a big and rich theme that there's many things that can be said within that umbrella. Should there be policy areas that fall outside of that very broad, I think, talking space? Yes, this is not a one-day event. We could have discussed it before the conference. We can even discuss it next week. There are ongoing policy workshops that happen on a weekly basis. So the conference is not the only opportunity to talk policy in a political party, but it is an opportunity to discuss perhaps areas where there are gaps, and to then also align and set out your priorities. But it's not the be all and end all and shouldn't be treated as such.
Thanks, Gwen. So for the one follow-up from Govin, I'm going to limit it to 30 seconds and the answers to just under a minute so that we can get off the facility to make provisions for others. I see there's a hand from Zianda. If you also have a follow-up, I'm going to limit you to under 30 seconds. So Govin, have your shot.
I'll give it my best shot, Solly. For clarity then, are you guys suggesting that we replace triple BEE with the SDG scorecard as government policy? Is that what's on the table? Then how could you possibly have an environment that is tolerable and open with an exodus of leaders of the Black Caucus and persecution of others, and some of them facing senior or serious disciplinary charges? And then more directly, are you anticipating any sort of disruption of your policy conference or virtual walkout by those who may have been allied to the leaders, former leaders of the Black Caucus in the DA that are leaving? And then on point number 1.8.2, you say that the DA unequivocally supports affirmative action. And you say that to promote equality of opportunity, the principle of addressing underlying causes of inequality as opposed to papering over the symptoms underpins all of our proposed interventions. Is this the standing DA policy to support affirmative action? Is this a different affirmative action from the government policy that we know?
Thanks, Govin. I see and Zianda's hand went down, which means that she's no longer interested in a follow-up. So Gwen and Ivan, on the political issues that were raised.
Thank you, colleagues. Firstly, let me say we don't expect any virtual walkout at our meetings, because in the Democratic Alliance, we encourage open debate. We're a liberal party. People express their views. We discuss it. And at the end of the day, it is the arguments that matters, and not the we always believe that people must not raise their voice but improve the argument. So we do not expect any such things. We are a disciplined organization, and certainly we will continue in having a very successful local policy conference this weekend.
Gwen, we can shoot straight into you.
Okay, I wouldn't want to call it a scorecard. I mean, remember, when we do policy, it's to address a particular policy problem, not to respond to ANC policy. So what this document wants to do is to address the issue of economic exclusion in the way that has been discussed, during the course of this morning. And so it's not a kind of like line for line rebuttal of what the ANC policy is. So the ANC policy has a scorecard. I think ours would talk about more SDG reporting, which is not a scorecard per se, but there are a number of international companies that do report on the alignment of their business model and practices with SDGs. And that's the approach that we would be looking to take, that in procuring with companies, should there be kind of tie, or companies that will equally provide a good service at good value for money, that we would consider the SDG contributions of the companies that we do business with. And I think that there was, sorry, very quickly, can you remind me of the last question? I think this question had 2 parts. Oh, right. Yes. So on affirmative action, I mean, it's very important that you read that section, that, you know, anyone, I'm not saying you specifically, but anyone reads that section carefully, because in South Africa, when we talk about affirmative action, we talk about it in a particular way. And the global discourse on affirmative action, it makes 2 distinctions. There's equal outcome affirmative actions. So it's affirmative action, but it's concerned with measuring the outcomes of affirmative action policy. And there's also affirmative action that talks about equality of opportunity. And so we say that we do support affirmative action, but it's a mistake to think that the way we do affirmative action in South Africa is the only way that affirmative action gets done, and that there is a policy conception of affirmative action that we do support, and it's the one that encourages equality of opportunity.
Thanks very much, Gwen and Dr. Ivan Meyer. So for logistical issues, we will be establishing a WhatsApp group that will be the main source of communication over the course of the weekend. Communications team and the operations available to filter in questions that you may have during the course of the weekend, but we'll release a statement at the end of Saturday, and we will be having a press conference on Monday, so that you will have a comprehensive opportunity for more questions about the 2-day conference, and most importantly, the key outcomes out of that conference. So if we didn't have enough time today, we are going to have plenty of time over the next 2 days, and more importantly, on Monday, to answer your questions. So colleagues from the media, I'd like to thank you very much for joining us and for being patient with our logistical team as we're trying to filter all of the questions. Hopefully we'll hear from you over the course of the weekend. Enjoy Friday. Bye.
Yeah, thanks, Ollie. Cheers.